Welcome back to the Think, See, Listen channel, where I give it to you raw, uncut, and uncensored, unedited, and completely unprofessional. Especially unprofessional. All to give glory to the Father, and to the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we are live, and it is Friday. And we are going to jump right back into our studies in our end times deep dive, anti-Christian history, through the lens of Orthodoxy. Let's just get to it. A Fakir's Miracle and the Prayer of Jesus by Archimandrite Nicholas Drobiazgin. I cannot do these Indian names and these Russian names. They kill me. They're very difficult to read. My Gringo Rican. Anyway. Archimandrite Nicholas D. The author of this testimony, a new martyr of the communist yoke, enjoyed a brilliant worldly career as a natural commander, being also deeply involved in occultism as editor of the occult journal Rebus. Being saved from almost certain death at sea by a miracle of Saint Seraphim, he made a pilgrimage to Sarov and then renounced his worldly career and occult ties to become a monk. After being ordained priest, he served as a missionary in China, India, and Tibet. As the priest of various embassy churches and as abbot of several monasteries. After 1914, he lived at the Kiev Caves Lavra, where he discoursed to the young people who visited him concerning the influence of occultism on contemporary events in Russia. In the autumn of 1924, 1 month after he had been visited by a certain Tuholks, the author of the book Black Magic, he was murdered in his cell by persons unknown, with obvious Bolshevik connivance, stabbed by a dagger with a special handle apparently of occult significance. The incident here described, revealing the nature of one of the mediumistic gifts which are common in Eastern religions. The incident here described, revealing the nature of one of the mediumistic gifts which are common in Eastern religions, took place not long before 1900 and was recorded about 1922 by Dr. A.P. Timofeyevich. Lately, of Novo, I can't read Russian, dude. On a wondrous early tropical morning, our ship was cleaving the waters of the Indian Ocean, nearing the island of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The lively faces of the passengers, for the most part Englishmen with their families who were traveling to their posts or on business in their Indian colony, looked avidly in the distance, seeking out with their eyes the enchanted isle, which for practically all of them had been bound up since childhood with so much that was interesting and mysterious in the tales and descriptions of travelers. The island was still scarcely visible when already a fine, intoxicating fragrance from the trees growing on it more and more enveloped the ship with each passing breeze. Finally, a kind of blue cloud lay on the horizon, ever increasing in size as the ship speedily approached. Already one could notice the buildings spread out along the shore, buried in the verdure of majestic palms, and the many-colored crowd of the local inhabitants who were awaiting the ship's arrival. The passengers, who had quickly become acquainted with each other on the trip, were laughing and conversing animatedly with each other on the deck, admiring the wondrous scene of the fairy tale isle as it unfolded before their eyes. The ship swung slowly around, preparing a moor at the dock of the port city of Colombo. Here the ship stopped to take on coal, and the passengers had sufficient time to go ashore. The day was so hot that many passengers decided not to leave the ship until evening, when a pleasant coolness replaced the heat of the day. A small group of 8 people, to which I joined myself, was led by Colonel Elliot, who had been in Colombo before and knew the city and its environs well, its environment well. He made an alluring proposition. "Ladies and gentlemen, wouldn't you like to go a few miles out of town and pay a visit to one of the local magician fakirs? Perhaps we shall see something interesting." All accepted the colonel's proposition with enthusiasm. It was already evening when we left behind the noisy streets of the city and rolled along a marvelous jungle road, which was twinkling with the sparks of millions of fireflies. Finally, the road suddenly widened. In front of us there was a small clearing surrounded on all sides by jungle. At the edge of the clearing, under a big tree, there was a kind of hut, next to which a small bonfire was smoldering, and a thin, emaciated old man with a turban on his head sat cross-legged and with his unmoving gaze directed at the fire. Despite our noisy arrival, the old man continued to sit completely immovable, not paying us the slightest attention. Somewhere from out of the darkness a youth appeared, and going up, the colonel quietly asked him something. In a short while he brought out several tools, and our group arranged itself in a semicircle not far from the bonfire. A light and fragrant smoke arose. The old man sat in the same pose, apparently noticing no one and nothing. The half-moon which arose dispelled to some extent the darkness of the night, and in the ghostly light all objects took on fantastic outlines. Involuntarily, everyone became quiet and waited to see what would happen. "Look, look there, on the tree," Miss Mary cried in an excited whisper. We all turned our heads in the direction indicated, and indeed the whole surface of the immense crown of the tree under which the fakir was sitting was as it were gently flowing in the soft illumination of the moon, and the tree itself began gradually to melt and lose its contours. Literally, some unseen hand had thrown over it an airy covering which became more and more concentrated with every moment. Soon the undulating surface of the sea presented itself with complete clarity before our astonished gaze. With a light rumble, one with a light rumble, one wave followed another, making foaming white caps. Light clouds were floating in a sky which had become blue. Stunned, we could not tear ourselves away from the striking picture, and in the distance there appeared a white ship. Thick smoke poured out of its two large smokestacks. It quickly approached us, cleaving the water. To our great amazement, we recognized it as our own ship, the one on which we had come to Colombo. A whisper passed through our ranks when we read on the stern, traced out in gold letters, the name of our ship, Louisa. But what astounded us most of all was what we saw on the ship, ourselves. Don't forget that at the time when all this happened, cinematography hadn't even been thought of, and it was impossible even to conceive of something like this. Each of us saw ourselves on the ship's deck, amongst people who were laughing and talking to each other. But what was especially astonishing, I saw not only myself, but at the same time the whole deck of the ship, down to the smallest details, as if in a bird's eye view, which of course simply could not be in actuality. At one and the same time, I saw myself among the passengers and the sailors working at the other end of the ship, and the captain in his cabin, and even our monkey Nellie, a favorite of all, eating bananas on the main mast. All my companions at the same time, each in his own way, were greatly excited at what they were seeing, expressing their emotions with soft cries and excited whispers. I had completely forgotten that I was a priest monk, and it would seem had no business at all participating in such a spectacle. The spell was so powerful that both the mind and the heart were silent. My heart began to beat painfully in alarm. Suddenly, I was beside myself. A fear took hold of my whole being. My lips began to move and say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Immediately, I felt relieved. It was just as if some mysterious chains which had bound me began to fall away. The prayer became more concentrated, and with it my peace of soul returned. I continued to look at the tree, and suddenly, as if pursued by the wind, the picture became clouded and was dispersed. I saw nothing more except the big tree, illumined by the light of the moon, and likewise the fakir sitting in silence by the bonfire, while my companions continued to express what they were experiencing while gazing at the picture, which for them had not been broken off. Power of the Jesus prayer. But then something apparently happened to the fakir also. He reeled to the side. The youth ran up to him in alarm. The seance was suddenly broken up. Deeply moved by everything they had experienced, the spectators stood up, animatedly sharing their impressions and not understanding at all why the whole thing had been cut off so sharply and unexpectedly. The youth explained it as owing to the exhaustion of the fakir, who was sitting as before, his head down and paying not the slightest attention to those present. Having generously rewarded the fakir through the youth for the opportunity to be participants of such astonishing spectacle, our group quickly got together for the trip back. While starting out, I involuntarily turned back once more in order to imprint in my memory the whole scene, and suddenly I shuddered from an unpleasant feeling. My gaze met the gaze of the fakir, which was full of hatred. It was but for a single instant, and then he again assumed his habitual position. But his glance once and for all opened my eyes to the realization of whose power it was that had produced this miracle. Eastern spirituality is by no means limited to such mediumistic tricks. As this fakir practiced, we shall see some of its more sincere aspects in the next chapter. Eastern spirituality is by no means limited to such mediumistic tricks as this fakir practiced. We shall see some of its more sincere aspects in the next chapter. Still, all the power that is given to the practitioners of Eastern religions comes from the same phenomenon of mediumism, whose central characteristic is a passiveness toward spiritual reality that enables one to enter into contact with the gods of the non-Christian religions. This phenomenon may be seen in Eastern meditation, even when it may be given the name of Christian, and perhaps even in those strange gifts which in our days of spiritual decline are mislabeled charismatic Christian. Eastern meditation invades Christianity as an answer to the question of the possibility of a dialogue of Orthodox Christianity with the various non-Christian religions. The reader has been presented the testimony of 3 Orthodox Christians who confirm, on the basis of Orthodox doctrine and their own experience, what the Orthodox Church has always taught, that Orthodox Christians do not at all have the same God as the so-called monotheists who deny the Holy Trinity, that the gods of the pagans are in fact demons, and that the experiences and powers which the pagan gods can and do provide are satanic in nature. All this in no way contradicts the words of St. Peter that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation that he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him, in Acts 10:34-35. Or the words of St. Paul that God in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Acts 14:17. Those who live in the bondage of Satan, the prince of this world, in darkness, which is unenlightened by the Christian gospel, are judged in the light that natural testimony of God, which every man may have despite this bondage. Those who live in the bondage of Satan, the prince of this world, in darkness, in unenlightened, which is in those who live in bondage of Satan, the prince of this world, in darkness which is unenlightened by the Christian gospel, are judged in the light of the natural testimony of God which every man may have, despite this bondage. For the Christian, however, who has been given God's revelation, no dialogue is possible with those outside the faith. Be ye not unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? What part hath he that believeth with an infidel? Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 17. The Christian calling is rather to bring the light of Orthodox Christianity to them, even as St. Peter did to the God-fearing household of Cornelius the centurion in Acts 10:34 through 48, in order to enlighten their darkness and join them to the chosen flock of Christ's church. All of this is obvious enough to Orthodox Christians who are aware of and faithful to the truth of God's revelation in the Church of Christ. But many who consider themselves Christians have very little awareness of the radical difference between Christianity and all other religions, and some who have this awareness have very little discernment in the area of spiritual experiences, a discernment that has been practiced and handed down in Orthodox patristic writings and lives of the saints for nearly 2,000 years. In the absence of such awareness and discernment, the increasing presence of Eastern religious movements in the West, especially in the past decade or two, has caused great confusion in the minds of many would-be Christians. The case of Thomas Merton comes immediately to mind, a sincere convert to Roman Catholicism and Catholic monasticism some 40 years ago, long before the radical reforms of Vatican II. He ended his days proclaiming the equality of Christian religious experiences and the experience of Zen Buddhism and other pagan religions. Something has entered the air in these past 2 decades or so that has eroded whatever remained of a sound Christian outlook in Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, and now is attacking the Church itself. Holy Orthodoxy. The dialogue with non-Christian religions is a result rather than a cause of this new spirit. In this chapter, we shall examine some of the Eastern religious movements which have been influential in the 1970s, with special emphasis on the attempts to develop a syncretism of Christianity and Eastern religions, particularly in the realm of spiritual practices. Such attempts, more often than not, cite the Philokalia and the Eastern Orthodox tradition of contemplative prayer as being more akin to Eastern spiritual practices than anything that exists in the West. It is time enough, then, to point out clearly the great abyss that exists between Christian and non-Christian spiritual experience, and why the religious philosophy that underlies this new syncretism is false and dangerous. Christian yoga. Hindu yoga has been known in the West for many decades, and especially in America, has been given rise to innumerable cults and also to a popular form of physical therapy which is supposedly non-religious in its aims. Nearly 20 years ago, a French Benedictine monk wrote of his experiences in making yoga a Christian discipline. The description that follows is taken from his book. Hindu yoga is a discipline that presupposes a rather abstemious, disciplined life and is composed of breath control and certain physical postures which produce a state of relaxation in which one meditates, usually with the help of a mantra or sacred utterance which aids concentration. The essence of yoga is not the discipline itself, but the meditation which is its end. The author is correct when he writes, The aims of Hindu yoga are spiritual. It is tantamount to treason to forget this and retain only the purely physical side of this ancient discipline, to see in it no more than a means towards bodily health or beauty. So it's treason to think yoga is just a health practice. The aims of yoga are spiritual. It is tantamount to treason to forget this and retain only the purely physical side of this ancient discipline, to see in it no more than a means towards bodily health or beauty. To this, it should be added that the person who uses yoga only for physical well-being is already disposing himself towards certain spiritual attitudes and even experiences of which he is undoubtedly unaware. Of this more will be said below. The same author then continues, The art of the yogi is to establish himself in a complete silence, to empty himself of all thoughts and illusions, to discard and forget everything but the one idea. Man's true self is divine. It is God, and the rest is silence. This idea, of course, is not Christian but pagan. But the aim of Christian yoga is to use the technique of yoga for a different spiritual end, for a Christian meditation. I used to try to do that. Like, I didn't do yoga. I used to just, sit and meditate on God and in weird stretching positions, trying to make my own, New Age religion. But anyway. The idea, of course, is not Christian but pagan, but the aim of Christian yoga is to use the technique of yoga for a different spiritual end, for a Christian meditation. The object of the yoga technique, in this view, is to make one relaxed, content, unthinking, and passive, or receptive to spiritual ideas and experiences. As soon as you have taken up the posture, you will feel your body relaxing, and a feeling of general well-being will establish itself in you. The exercises produce an extraordinary sense of calm. To begin with, one gets the feeling of a general unwinding, of a well-being taking hold, of a euphoria that will and in fact does last. If one's nerves have been tense and overstrung, the exercises calm them, and fatigue disappears in a little time. The good of all his efforts, the yogi's effort, the good of all his efforts is to silence the thinking self in him by shutting his eyes to every kind of enticement. The euphoria which yoga brings could well be called a state of health that allows us to do more and to do it better on the human plane to begin with, and on the Christian religious spiritual plane afterwards. The most apt word to describe it is contentedness. A contentedness that inhabits body and soul and predisposes us toward the spiritual life. One's whole personality can be changed by it. Hatha Yoga influences character to the good. One man, after some weeks of practice, admits he no longer knows himself, and everyone notices a change in his bearing and reaction. He is gentler and more understanding. He faces experience calmly. He is content. His whole personality has been altered, and he himself feels it steadying and opening out. From this, there arises an almost permanent condition of euphoria, of contentedness. But all of this is only a preparation of a spiritual aim, which begins to make itself felt in a very short time. By becoming contemplative in a matter of weeks, my prayer had been given a particular novel cast. Becoming extraordinarily calm, the author notices the ease I felt in entering into prayer, in concentrating on a subject. One becomes more receptive to impulses and promptings from heaven. The practice of yoga makes for increased suppleness and receptivity, and thus for openness to those personal exchanges between God and the soul that mark the way of the mystical life. Even for the apprentice yogi, prayer becomes sweet and embraces the whole of man. One is relaxed and ready to tremble at the touch of the Holy Ghost, to receive and welcome what God in his goodness thinks fit to let us experience. We shall be making our being ready to be taken, to be seized, and this is surely one of the forms, the highest of Christian contemplation. Let me reread that. We shall be making our being ready to be taken, to be seized. And this is surely one of the forms, in fact, the highest of Christian contemplation. Every day, the exercises and indeed the whole ascetic discipline of yoga make it easier for the grace of Christ to flow in me. I feel my hunger for God growing, and my thirst for righteousness, and my desire to be a Christian in the full strength of the word. Man, I used to be like that. Anyone who understands the nature of prelest or spiritual deception will recognize in this description of Christian yoga precisely the characteristics of those who have gone spiritually astray, whether into pagan religious experiences or sectarian Christian experiences. The same striving for holy and divine feelings, the same openness and willingness to be seized by the Spirit, the same seeking not for God but for spiritual consolations, the same self-intoxication which is mistaken for a state of grace, the same incredible ease with which one becomes contemplative or mystical, the same mystical revelations and pseudo-spiritual states. These are the common characteristics of all who are in this particular state of spiritual deception. But the author of Christian Yoga, being a Benedictine monk, adds some particular meditations which reveal him as fully in the spirit of the Roman Catholic meditation of recent centuries, with its free play of fantasies on Christian themes. Thus, for example, having meditated on a theme of the Christmas Eve Mass, he begins to see the child in the arms of his mother. I gaze, nothing more. Pictures, ideas, associations of ideas. Savior, King, light, halo, shepherd, child, light, again. Come one after the other, march past. All these pieces of a sacred puzzle taken together arouse one idea in me, a silent vision of the whole mystery of Christmas. Anyone with the slightest knowledge of Orthodox spiritual discipline will see that this pitiable Christian yogi has fallen handily into a trap set by one of the lesser demons that lie in wait for the seeker of spiritual experiences. He has not even seen an angel of light, but has only given way to his own religious fancies, the product of a heart and mind totally unprepared for spiritual warfare and the deceptions of the demons. Such meditation is being practiced today in a number of Roman Catholic convents and monasteries. The fact that the book concludes with an article by the French translator of the Philokalia, together with excerpts from the Philokalia, only reveals the abyss that separates these dilettantes from the true spirituality of Orthodoxy, which is totally inaccessible to the modern wise men who no longer understand its language. A sufficient indication of the author's incompetence in understanding the Philokalia is the fact that he gives the name prayer of the heart, which in Orthodox tradition is the highest mental prayer, acquired by very few only after many years of ascetic struggle and being humbled by a true God-bearing elder, to the easy trick of reciting syllables in rhythm with the heartbeat. We shall comment more fully below on the dangers of this Christian yoga when noting what it possesses in common with other forms of Eastern meditation, which are being offered to Christians today. Christian Zen. An Eastern religious practice on a more popular level is offered in the book of Irish Catholic priest William Johnston, Christian Zen. The author starts from basically the same place as the author of Christian Yoga. A feeling of dissatisfaction with Western Christianity. A desire to give it a dimension of contemplation or meditation. Many people disconnected with old forms of prayer, many people discontented with old forms of prayer, discontented with the old devotions that once served so well, are looking for something that will satisfy the aspirations of the modern heart. Contact with Zen has opened up new vistas, teaching me that there are possibilities in Christianity I never dreamed of. One may practice Zen as a way of deepening and broadening his Christian faith. The technique of Japanese Zen is very similar to that of Indian yoga, from which it is ultimately derived, although it is rather simpler. There is the same basic posture, but not the variety of postures of yoga, breathing technique, the repetition of a sacred name if desired, as well as other techniques peculiar to Zen. The aim of these techniques is the same as that of yoga, to abolish rational thinking and attain a state of calm, silent meditation. The sitting position impedes discursive reasoning and thinking, and enables one to go down to the center of one's being in imageless and silent contemplation, to a deep and beautiful realm of psychic life, to deep interior silence. The experience thus attained is somewhat similar to that achieved by taking drugs. For people who have used drugs understand a little about Zen, since they have been awakened to the realization that there is a depth in the mind worth exploring. Yeah. And yet, this experience opens up a new approach to Christ, an approach that is less dualistic or more oriental. Even absolute beginners in Zen can attain a sense of union and an atmosphere of supernatural presence, a savoring of mystical silence through Zen, the state of contemplation hitherto restricted to a few mystics can be broadened out, and all may have vision, all may reach samadhi, enlightenment. The author of Christian Zen speaks of the renewal of Christianity, but he admits that the experience he thinks can bring it about but he admits that the experience he thinks can bring it about may be had by anyone. Hold on. The author of Christian Zen speaks of the renewal of Christianity, but he admits that the experience he thinks can bring it about may be had by anyone, Christian or non-Christian. I believe that there is a basic enlightenment, which is neither Christian nor Buddhist. I believe there is a basic enlightenment, which is neither Christian nor Buddhist nor anything else. It is just human. Indeed, at a convention on meditation at a Zen temple near Kyoto, the surprising thing about the meeting was lack of any common faith. No one seemed the slightest bit interested in what anyone else believed or disbelieved, and no one, as far as I recall, even mentioned the name of God. The agnostic character of meditation has a great advantage for missionary purposes, for in this way meditation can be taught to people who have little faith, to those who are troubled in conscience or fear that God is dead. Such people can always sit and breathe. For them, meditation becomes a search, and I have found that people who begin to search in this way eventually find God. Not the anthropomorphic God that they have not the anthropomorphic God they have rejected, but the great being in whom we live, move, and are. The author's description of the Zen enlightenment experience reveals its basic identity with the cosmic experience provided by shamanism and many pagan religions. I myself believe that within us are locked up torrents and torrents of joy that can be released by meditation. Sometimes they will burst through with incredible force, flooding the personality with an extraordinary happiness that comes from one knows not where. Interestingly, the author, on returning to America after 20 years in Japan, found this experience to be very close to the Pentecostal experience, and he himself received the baptism of the Holy Spirit at a charismatic meeting. The author concluded, returning to the Pentecostal meeting, it seems to me that the imposition of hands, the prayers of the people, the charity of the community, these can be forces that release the psychic power that brings enlightenment to the person who has been consistently practicing Zazen We shall examine in the 7th chapter of this book the nature of the Pentecostal or charismatic experience. I did a video on that previously. I'm probably going to be revisiting that again because I really want to drive some of these points home. Little need be said in criticism of these views. They are basically the same as those of the author of Christian Yoga, only less esoteric and more popular. Anyone who believes that the agnostic pagan experience of Zen can be used for a contemplative renewal within Christianity surely knows nothing whatsoever of the great contemplative tradition of Orthodoxy, which presupposes burning faith, true faith, and intense asceticism. Wait, let me just read that again. Anyone who believes that the agnostic pagan experience of Zen can be used for a contemplative renewal within Christianity surely knows nothing whatsoever of the great contemplative tradition of Orthodoxy, which presupposes burning faith, true faith, and intense ascetic struggle, and yet the same author does not hesitate to drag the Philokalia and the great Orthodox schools into his narrative, stating that they also lead to the condition of contemplative silence and peace, and are an example of Zen within the Christian tradition. And he advocates the use of the prayers of Jesus during Zen meditation for those who wish this. Such ignorance is positively dangerous, especially when the possessor of it invites the students at his lectures as an experiment in mysticism to sit in zazen for 40 minutes each evening. How many sincere, misguided, false prophets there are in the world today, each thinking he is bringing benefit to his fellow man, instead of an invitation to psychic and spiritual disaster. Of this we shall speak more in the conclusion below. It is a true shame, because it is in good, good intentions, well-meaning, trying to help each other out, help you spiritually. How many sincere, misguided false prophets there are in the world today, each thinking he is bringing benefit to his fellow man instead of an invitation to psychic and spiritual disaster. Transcendental meditation. The technique of Eastern meditation known as transcendental meditation has attained such popularity. The technique of Eastern meditation known as transcendental meditation has attained such popularity in a few years, especially in America, as is advocated in such an outrageously flippant tone that any serious student of contemporary religious currents will be inclined at first to dismiss it as merely an overinflated product of American advertising and showmanship. But this would be a mistake, for in its serious claims it does not differ markedly from yoga and Zen, and a close at its techniques reveals it as perhaps more authentically Eastern than either of the somewhat artificial syncretisms Christian yoga and Christian Zen. Uh-oh. According to one standard account of this movement, transcendental meditation was brought to America, where it has had its most spectacular success by a rather unorthodox Indian yogi, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and began to grow noticeably about 1961. In 1967, it received widespread publicity when the popular singers known as the Beatles were converted to it and gave up drugs, but they soon abandoned the movement, although they continued to meditate. And the Maharishi hit his low point the next year when his American tour, together with another convert singing group called the Beach Boys, was abandoned as a financial failure. The movement itself, however, continued to grow. By 1971, there I think we're back. By 1971, there were some 100,000 meditators following it, with 2,000 specially trained instructors, making it already by far the largest movement of Eastern spirituality. In 1975, the movement reached its peak with about 40,000 trainees a month and upwards of 600,000 followers in all. During these years, it was widely used in the army, public schools, prisons, hospitals, and by church groups, including parishes of the Greek archdiocese in America, as supposedly neutral